Welcome to the How to Overthink podcast. Today we have Jimmy Elphick. Jimmy Elphick has recently made the transition from being a full-time employee to entrepreneurship and has founded his own Webflow agency that helps growth teams utilize Webflow more effectively. Jimmy, welcome to the show.
Cool. Thank you for having me on, Jesse. I was saying before this, but I'll just say it again just for this. But me and Jesse worked together at Ben, a tech startup before, and I think this is the perfect occupation for you. That Jesse's thing was always, he'd always have an interesting question or something like that, and it would always keep us busy when we were trying to procrastinate on a Thursday afternoon or something like that. So yeah, it seems like the perfect route for you, and it's good fun. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, man. Appreciate that. Cool. Starting question then. Would you be able to give a bit of background on your career in terms of like where you started, how you developed your expertise in Webflow, and then up until the moment that you made the decision recently to doing it full time for your own thing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it seems like I don't know if it seemed like it, but maybe a bit sudden just to kind of like do it this year and go out on my own. But actually, it's been something I've basically been putting off forever. Like I've always wanted to be an entrepreneur, always doing like little hacky things, trying to earn a bit of money or just make something cool. I think for me, maybe the making stuff is like more important than the money, but I've always been doing that. I went to university and I did like business with entrepreneurship because I didn't know what I wanted to do. I thought I basically had to go to uni and this that, and the other. Was involved in like loads of different startup things there, like the entrepreneurship society, did like pitching competitions, this that and the other. Basically everything failed pretty much, but every time I got involved in something, I wanted to find a way of being useful pretty much, and that kind of in the end ended up being like design or like building the website and stuff like that, because I'd always get involved with like engineers and I was a bit afraid of like code and stuff like that, so it ended up being the design side that I get involved in, and then like all the business bits as well. After uni, went to work for startups in marketing, so that's what my degree is. Again, I was just trying to be helpful and I thought I can definitely do that, and eventually kind of slipped into learning Webflow because I think it kind of allowed me to get into building stuff I wanted to do. I've always been like super independent and wanting to like build something myself.
Quick question.
Sure.
For someone that knows nothing about Webflow,
Yeah.
or maybe nothing about marketing and growth, what is Webflow? What does it do for businesses?
So there's a couple ways of thinking about Webflow, I'd say. I mean, on one hand, it's just a website builder, but then I think it's slightly different in the sense that you can kind of build anything you want with it. So there's like a whole category of website builders like Squarespace, Wix. I mean, you've heard of them all, but a lot of them keep you very templated in, basically by trying to hide what's actually going on in the back end, like the code, and not basically allowing you to do whatever you want because they think people are going to fuck it up, which a lot of people basically will. But where Webflow is unique is it's more of like a visual development platform. So it doesn't hide you away from the CSS and HTML. It just puts it in like a visual way. So you can build anything you want. There's a bit more of a learning curve because of that. But once you get over that, you can basically build anything you want and you kind of have unlimited freedom to do what you want with websites. That's kind of what I realized over the years of using it. And that's why I think they'll kind of beat other website builders, because in the end, they're not restricting you in any sort of way. You can kind of really build whatever you want. It allows for like a great ecosystem of developers as well, because it introduces people to like more advanced topics by making it like more appealing, if that makes sense. And why it's so great for marketing and growth teams, because of what I just mentioned. It's easy and it's quick and it's very visual. So in some sense, they can come in and like do edits and stuff themselves. But also it's extremely quick, and the kind of like changing to publishing cycle is really fast. I know you definitely would have noticed that, Ben. We made changes almost every day. And I think that's the nature of websites now. It used to be more of like a one and done thing. Now you take like a year to build a website and then it was published, and then you probably wouldn't make any changes for maybe like 6 months, or you need a new page here and there. But now a website is kind of always evolving, you know what I mean? Especially if you're a growth team, you need a new landing page, you need to make changes to this copy, you want to A/B test that, you have to make changes and make them really quickly. And I think that's where Webflow is like really powerful.
Nice, cool. And what company were you at? And what were your roles or maybe your responsibilities when you first got to grips with Webflow?
So I'd say it was at the back end of the place I was at before Ben, Paperclip. It was like a marketplace similar to like Spock or Vinted and stuff like that. And I guess I just got slightly frustrated at the end. Every time you wanted to make a change to the website, we had to go to our like development team, and they were just super busy with other things. Like, they don't have the time or the energy to help you, and it's just like a silly marketing thing. So basically, the changes you wanted would never get done, or it would take a lifetime. So what I ended up doing was rebuilding our like landing page website in Webflow, and kind of taking it to my CEO boss, Rich, at the end and being like, look, listen, I've done this. It's basically the same thing, but we can make changes whenever we want. We ended up never like releasing it and going with it because I ended up basically leaving. There was no point during that period, but I kind of opened my eyes to me. It's like, oh shit, like I can actually do this. Like from where I was pretty much like afraid of code and stuff like that before, I didn't want to get involved in case I messed it up or it's too complicated, it wasn't for me. I now gave me like a bit of confidence to do that. So ever since then, any like side hustle idea I'd have, or like website I wanted to build, directories, whatever, I was building it in Webflow, finding a way to do it. Eventually managed to get a few like freelance clients on the side, and it kind of just built and snowballed from there. When I got to Ben, they had a Webflow site. And so me being like very keen at the beginning, trying to like impress, I was like, oh, I can do this. Like, let me take this on, this, that, and the other. Ended up taking it on. And then the Ben website, Ben did really well in the end. The website got massive. We grew really quick, and it basically became my full-time job there as well. So that's how I kind of transitioned from marketing into Webflow development. But I like to consider myself, especially now I've kind of started my own thing, I'm never going to let those like marketing skills go, and I think I'll be using them a lot, and that's going to be kind of like my niche to pitch to marketing teams, as I know kind of what you need, but I can also develop it as well.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Cool. And then we'll jump back to Webflow in a moment.
Sure.
But first, you're at Ben up until fairly recently.
Yep.
At what point, like what really was the moment where you're like, okay, now I'm going to do it on my own. Yeah. I'm going to go solo, going to start my own thing.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I've actually thought about this a lot because the moment it happened was actually really distinct, and I remember it very clearly. But it was almost like a positive thing. Like it wasn't like a negative thing, like you've got to do this, and I was hating getting orders or this, that, and the other. It wasn't like that. It was actually like a really positive moment, and it was the moment I walked into the new office. So for a bit of context, at Ben, we'd always been, for like the 3 years that I was there, we started in this little WeWork. My first day, I helped the guys move the screens and desks into the office. That was my first day. And then until about probably 6 months before I left, I don't know, maybe February this year, that's when we finally got our own place. It was like branded, everything to do with Ben, with the new brand and everything like that. And it looked really slick. It's a really nice modern building. But I walked in there, and I was like, oh, this is so cool. This is like perfect for the company. It's going to go leaps and bounds from here. But it just felt like the end for me in like a weird way. Like I was like, okay, you know what? This is all great. It's all really good. It's going to get better, but it's still not going to like 100% be what I want to do. And I just didn't see any way past that they could like improve the experience or improve the experience of being employed, this and the other. That would kind of like satiate me, if that makes sense. I knew from then, I was like, fuck, like I've got to go do my own thing. Yeah, and ever since then, I think I probably handed my notice in maybe like a week later. But yeah.
That's cool. I like that. And then what is the name of your agency, and how would you describe its kind of core value proposition in a quick elevator pitch?
Yeah, so it's called Jimmy's World. I don't really know where it came from, just kind of sounded cool. Jimmy's World without the O, because I couldn't get the domain, obviously.
I thought, when I saw the Jimmy's World thing, I thought it was a reference to, you know, whenever you're like learning some kind of like coding language, the first thing is hello world.
Yeah.
I thought it might be a reference to that.
Yeah, so there's a couple things it kind of reference to. One of them is that kind of like my kind of like story or arc, whatever it is, that I kind of overcame the fear of code, and then through Webflow, so I still use no or low code tools, but I'm not afraid to do it anymore. So that is part of the reference. There's also really random, but there's like a rapper who died, you know, Juice WRLD.
I don't know.
No, but anyway, he's kind of like got a very like cult following. I listen to a lot of his music and stuff like that, and he adds the world without the O. So that's kind of where the idea came from. So let me try this. Domain was free. And then obviously also the domain as well. Like you've got to have a .com, and it worked pretty well. I think it's quite distinctive and people will remember it. But in terms of what I'm trying to achieve with it, I noticed at Ben that there was like a real need to have someone there, like almost like all the time, to kind of create like these new pages, these new tests, this and the other with Webflow. And whilst like the marketing team could do it, that a lot of the time it would lead to errors, or it wasn't done correctly, it wasn't done with best practices, and that's what they really need, right? Like you need a fast website that can scale with you really quickly. So I noticed that need, spoke to a few other people, started working with a few different clients, and just noticed, this is kind of like a common thing. Like growth teams need like a developer on hand. Oftentimes they don't have the budget. Like it was kind of lucky at Ben that I transitioned into that role, because they maybe wouldn't have the budget to get someone full time, and there's not a lot of people out there with those skills, and they don't want to like pull engineering in because they don't want to waste their time, because at startup when you're growing really quick, those resources are so valuable. Like they need to be spending all their time on the product, so pulling them into like a marketing website is just going to be painful, either for engineering, they're going to lose that time, or marketing, they're going to end up waiting ages for engineering to make changes and stuff like that. So yeah, notice the niche, and I'm using my expertise in growth and my expertise in Webflow. It's kind of like my Venn diagram, somewhere in the middle. I can advise you on what to build, but I can also build it in a really efficient and like high quality way as well.
Cool. I like that. And also particularly that part around like advising on what to build is super important, because if you are having a conversation with a web developer and they aren't looking at it with that kind of commercial lens, then it does mean things can get missed, or they make small changes, which for them is just, they've just swapped two elements around, but actually maybe from a conversion rate optimization perspective, or even thinking about it from a user psychology perspective, something can suddenly be missed. So yeah, hugely valuable niche. Jumping back to Webflow.
Sure.
What advice would you give to someone maybe at the start of their career, or even someone looking to upskill later in their career? What advice would you give to them to getting started with Webflow?
Just build stuff. That's what I would say. Have ideas that you want to build, or if you don't have ideas, like find cool websites you like and try and recreate it. You can follow like courses and all that kind of stuff, but I'm sure you've like bought a couple in your time. I've definitely bought a few and been like, I'm going to do this, follow it all the way through. You just get tired of it because there's no like motivation to finish something like that. Have something you want to build, an idea, a startup, a cool website you've seen. Just try and rebuild it in Webflow. Go through YouTube. There's millions of tutorials now on like how to do this one specific thing. So when you're stuck, find a tutorial for it. But just start by building stuff that you want to build, because you'll have the motivation to start that and to finish it. If you looked at like my like Webflow account and like scrolled back, there's so much shit in there from ages ago, which I'm just, I wonder how you do this, try this. Just play around with it, and eventually you'll get there. I mean, maybe not the best advice, but maybe like overcommit to some stuff. Like say yes to some things that maybe you're not good enough to do yet, because you'll get there. Especially if there's that external pressure, you'll figure it out. Yeah, just build stuff and put yourself out there. Get involved in the community as well is also really good. There's always people who are willing to help you out there. Yeah.
Could you jump into that more in terms of the Webflow community, and what is that like, and what have you potentially learned or discovered through being involved in the Webflow community?
So much. I mean, first of all, you go there and it's just people who are interested in the same thing as you. So that's just a bonus, like straight off the bat, just people with common interests. There's no harm at all in like getting to know those people and eventually like becoming friends. Second of all, like, I mean, just commercial opportunities as well. People always maybe like have a project that's not right for them or need some extra help. There's always opportunities there, especially when you're starting out. If you go there to people and say, listen, I'm open for business, maybe at the beginning you'll do it slightly cheaper because you're still learning this and the other. People will have opportunities for you. And you'll learn a lot as well. Like there's always talks and stuff like that at the events, and you'd be like, I didn't even think of that. I didn't know that existed. So yeah, you can learn a lot from it as well. The community is really great. I would like say maybe just never try and get yourself like too jammed into one community, because you don't want to be like, I don't know, at the hand of Webflow, you know what I mean, the whole time. Just too pinned into that community. But going to events with people with similar interests and stuff like that is so valuable.
Interesting. And then thinking about, feeling, very close to Webflow, getting hammed in, I think was your expression.
Yeah.
What for you, in a broad way, what for you are the pros and cons of Webflow compared to other platforms?
Sure. I guess it kind of depends on your use case. I'll speak mainly on like marketing websites, because if we're talking about e-commerce, then there's just like a giant there that is clearly the best, which is Shopify.
Gotcha.
So it's not really comparable, and the e-commerce on Webflow isn't that great. But if we're talking about like marketing websites, then the pros, I would say, like I said, very fast development cycle. You can go and make changes, and it can be live in like minutes. They're bringing out a lot more features to do with components and stuff now, which makes it easier for non-developers to go in and make edits and even build pages really quickly. The CMS is great and easy to use, so that's great for editors and content people. And at the lower level, the pricing's quite fair as well. The cons, I would say, is it's not open source. So like WordPress, for example, is open source. There's like a few competitors popping up that is open source. It's not the end of the world. It kind of means you probably end up with a cleaner end product, because there is people like owning it.
For someone who might not know anything about what open source means or is in the context of a platform that you can log into, what does open source mean, both conceptually and practically?
So yeah, conceptually, it basically means that the code or the way the product's built is open for you to see. So you can literally go and find exactly how they built that feature, exactly why they did it and stuff like that. So that means you can effectively add your own stuff on as well. So if there's a feature you don't have and you're a good enough developer, you can go in there and just basically make it yourself, which is great. And making it open kind of implies you're not hiding anything. It's like a bit of a symbol to the community. It's like, okay, well, we were open with what we're doing because it's really good, and it's less kind of commercialized in that sense. Practically, it maybe does mean you end up with a bit more of a Frankenstein of a product, especially if people are building their own plugins and stuff like that. Maybe a bit less clean and doesn't look as great because people build their own aesthetics and stuff like that. But yeah, you can end up with a lot more features in a product a lot quicker when you've got the whole community working on it rather than kind of keeping it behind closed doors. In the case of Webflow, they built a really great product anyway. And they are creating that, like the app marketplace, which will probably allow for a lot of this. But yeah, being open source would be an advantage, I'm guessing.
Makes sense. Yeah. And then thinking about another marketing platform that's particularly used a lot in B2B, but I think B2C as well, Figma.
Yeah.
How does Figma and Workflow work well together or not work well together?
Yeah, I mean, so they kind of have two different purposes, but I think as the technology is getting better, they're almost like converging. Like, I don't think it'd be too far away when we have a world where like Figma can be your website, or you can design in Webflow. But Figma is for design. So it basically has like no barriers, let's say. So you can kind of draw something here, create a square here, this, that, and the other. And there's no responsiveness to it. There's not like locked into any sort of, unless you use auto layout or something like that, but there's no like kind of like rules like saying it should be this size at this, and the other. You can do whatever you want and be really creative with it. Webflow still like has to abide by like the laws of like HTML and CSS, right? So it's like a box inside a box. At this breakpoint, this changes to that, this, that, and the other. So it's a lot more rigid. So some people do go straight to Webflow if you're kind of like creative enough to see it. But a lot of the time, there's like a massive advantage to like having that freedom in Figma and then putting that into Webflow once you've kind of decided the structure. In terms of like the workflow, a lot of the times, and this is kind of comes back to how I think I'll work a lot with growth companies, is usually they have a designer or someone in-house. They'll design the page, they'll go as crazy as you want, and then I can go in, look at it, see it from like a HTML or CSS perspective and be like, okay, this needs to be this needs to be this structure, and then basically build it straight from there. They have a Figma to Webflow plugin now, which is okay. It does kind of work. But I think Webflow have done that because they've kind of seen a world where Figma are integrating into their products a lot more of these HTML and CSS principles, which could eventually mean that they'll have their own website builder themselves, and people might not need Webflow, so they're trying to get in there early with the integration.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. That's quite cool. That's quite cool. What is the biggest competitor to Webflow, would you say, if there is one?
So, I mean, WordPress is still the biggest player in the market. I think, like, I don't know what it is, but like 80% of websites on the internet are built through WordPress. So that will always be a massive player. In terms of like new style designers, a lot of the traditional website builders that were quite template-y before, like Wix, for example, are coming out with their own, basically a copy and paste of Webflow. So there'll be slight competitors. And there's also one called Web Studio as well, which is quite interesting. That's the open source version of Webflow pretty much. And it can also, well, I'm not sure just yet, but they're building it so you can build offline as well. So you can just have it on your computer, similar to how you can kind of code on your computer offline. If Webflow was a true just visual development platform where you're just writing HTML and CSS but visually, then there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to do that off your desktop pretty much. And that's kind of what Web Studio is trying to do. It'd be interesting to see how it turns out. But yeah, they're a few of the competitors, what they're doing.
Interesting. And now looking at entrepreneurship and your agency selling these Webflow services to growth teams, how do you think about how you price yourself? We don't need to go into specifics, but more conceptually, how do you think about how you price yourself? And I'm thinking that particularly through the lens of, in businesses, you often have revenue generating functions and then cost centers. The cost center, there's essentially a cap on the value of an employee or a service. But, particularly in growth or sales, there's not necessarily a cap on the amount of revenue that person can generate. In theory, sure. It's, exponential / unlimited in theory.
Yeah.
With that in mind, for something like websites, which maybe someone could confuse as a cost center, but in this case is not, it's for a growth function. How do you think about how you price yourself?
Yeah, for sure. It's an interesting one because, like you said, in sales and marketing, like theoretically, there's no like cap on the amount of the revenue you can bring in. But I think a lot of people think the opposite of developers a lot of the time. They're kind of frustrated having to pay a lot for them because they're like, oh, we just need this done. They don't really have to ideate anything. We've got the idea that's going to generate revenue. I just want them to put the pixels on the page, basically. So I think that's why I'm going for that growth niche as well in development, because the idea could be 100x value, like 100x more valuable than the actual development. For example, if I came up with an idea for a page on your website which generates loads and loads of organic traffic and gets you a ton of leads, for a B2B business that could be hundreds of thousands, millions of pounds worth of revenue. So you have to think about a couple of things. It's how much value you bring to the business, so how much extra revenue can this bring in, and balance that with like the costs they might traditionally pay. For example, hiring someone. That's something I bring into account as well, because to hire a developer, you're going to have to spend a couple of months maybe like searching for them, finding someone, maybe paying recruiters. So there's a cost associated with that. And then they might not be right when you get in and you've like locked into a contract and this, that, and the other. And you also might not need someone full time, but you have to pay someone full time to be there. So there's the cost of that as well. So a balance between how much value are you bringing to the company, and how much would they have to pay to do this a different way, and then trying to like find somewhere in between that's like you're worth it, if that makes sense, and like communicating that as well. Trying to communicate to them, I'm doing this and this can be worth this much to you, because some people might just not see it like that, especially straight off the bat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Okay, a more fun question. Thinking about your agency where it is right now, what for you would be the ideal client in terms of something that would really interest you? If you're thinking about either a brand that ideally a specific brand, but if not a kind of company or industry, what would be the ideal client?
Yeah, I mean, if I gave a boring answer, I'd literally be like where we worked, basically, Ben. That's what I'm targeting, is like high growth tech companies, because I think that's where like I'd fit in perfectly and bring the most value. But in terms of like a fun client, I mean, like Tesla would be fun. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just like these massive companies, there'd be so much more to think about in a company that size, like so much more security and stuff like that. But it would be a fun thing to work on. Yeah.
Gotcha. Really cool. A question that came to mind as you were speaking, and particularly from a growth perspective, is cookie policies.
Right. Yeah.
Which, you know, was something that we spent a lot of time thinking about at Ben and in general. How do you think, this might be too tough of a question,
Right.
but how do you think a company should structure its cookie policy to, you know, collect the maximum amount of data, but also stay compliant?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, like you said, we spent a lot of time going into this, and it is just like you could spend forever on this basically. And the worst part about it is it's like the least policed law in history or something like that. Like, I don't think anyone's ever been convicted of not having a cookie policy. There's basically no way of like tracking it, this, that, and the other. So a lot of people, I'm not saying you should do this, just don't have one, and like they go on with their life and nothing really comes of it.
After a brief camera malfunction, back in the room, speaking about cookie policies,
Right.
which Jimmy described as the least policed policy.
Yeah, the least policed law in history, I think.
Cool.
I mean, you can fact check me on that, but like, I basically think like no one ever has ever really been caught up in it. Doesn't mean you shouldn't like abide by it, because I mean it was put in place for a reason, which is obviously like people's data is like precious, right? But yeah, it can be a bit of a minefield. Like you can go about it a few different ways. Some ways technically aren't legal, but still like kind of imply that you have a policy. You just have a pop-up that's like, we do cookies, and then you can get rid of it. And then you can go further down that route, which is like having people be able to select what data you're allowed to collect from them and whatnot. And that obviously gets more complicated in development as well, and is a bit more of a time suck, but still works. Yeah, it's like very legally abiding or whatever. Yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah, I think a lot of people would be surprised how many of those cookie pop-ups on websites don't do anything.
Yeah.
Because the website itself is just not compliant. They're collecting your data anyway. But on the other hand, for companies that, particularly in B2B, where there are strict certifications or third-party verification that they have to go through, you know, for example, ISO and things like that at Ben, it is very important for them to get it right. And there's quite a lot of work that goes into getting those right.
Yeah, I mean, it can even come into sales as well. Because I remember a security guy at a company I worked for basically telling me that a lot of like they don't really like care what it does, but it's, say for example, a company's looking at buying Ben and they have strict security policies themselves. A quick check for them, especially if we're a startup and they kind of want to be like, oh, like fact check these people. A quick check for them will just be to come to your website and see like what's your cookie policy and like what's your pop-up do, and maybe check if it works. Like that's just a quick check for them to be like, okay, are these guys abiding by laws and security? So it can even help like in sales and stuff like that, because you could just be quickly crossed out of conversations if you don't have it.
Yeah, that's a big thing. It's not policed until the moment that you get caught out, and then it's absolutely devastating.
Definitely.
Potentially. Cool. Fun question then. 12 years time, or let's say 10 to 15 years
Very
time.
specific.
Yeah,
12 years and 4 months.
in 12 in 10 to 15 years time,
right,
looking back at where you are now, what advice would you give yourself?
Wait, so for me in 10 years time, what do I think I should know basically? Or
your future self,
my future
giving
self.
your current self advice.
Right, interesting one. I mean, it's so hard to tell like where I'll be then. I know, like I've heard it from multiple people, I'm not sure the exact source, but the quote is like something to do like you're disappointed with what you can do in a year, but like what you can do in 10 years is like, what's the other?
I think the Tim Ferriss one, where it's most people overestimate what they can do in a day, but underestimate how much they can do in a year. Yeah,
exactly. So like I think that applies to both timescales, right? Like, and that's something I'm constantly having to like basically tell myself, because I don't know, you're probably similar to me. Like oftentimes I'll get to the end of the day and I'm like, shit, I haven't done this, like I haven't done that, and it gets you down, disappointed. But when you look back at like a 6 month or a year time scale, then you're actually kind of like not impressed with yourself. You're like, oh, okay, I actually did that, like that's cool. So maybe would just be just relax, try stay on the right path, and don't get so caught up in the day to day. Just like keep that long term vision and keep working towards that.
I like that. And then following on from that, what is your favorite book that you're reading right now?
Right.
Doesn't have to be a book, could also be a podcast or resource, but what is your favorite resource right now?
Nice. I mean, a book I read recently, it's called The Creative Act by Rick Rubin. He's very like woo woo and this, that, and the other, and like some of the stuff is a bit like, all right, yeah, okay, mate. But also, it does get you thinking a lot about like what it means to be creative and how can you be more creative in your own work. A big like concept I took from it is that like doing something super creatively doesn't always lead to like better statistics or a better business outcome, but that doesn't mean it's not worth it. Like it's way more fulfilling, and I think just leaves like a better taste in people's mouths when they see something that's been done like very intentionally, or like has been spent a lot of time additional that didn't need to be done, but still like looks really cool. Like, you know, art gives you a certain feeling and you don't really know why. That sticks with people a lot more than you probably think. So yeah, Creative Act, it's a great book.
Nice. I like that. Cool. And then final question, thinking about yourself 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Maybe either as you're, you know, let's say around the moment you're going off to uni or you're just finishing uni, what advice would your current self give your past self?
Yeah, I think like the going off to uni moment is like such like an important one. I mean, it can be similar thing to different people, like, I don't know, moving away or going traveling or getting a new job, this and the other. I think especially when you're younger, I thought way too much about making the perfect decision. For example, like what degree are you going to pick? Like I was thinking, oh, should I do engineering? Should I do that? And I was like, had a lot of anxiety about picking the right thing. But I think looking back, like it barely matters. So just pick something. I'm a true believer, like you can choose to be like passionate about something and choose to dive deep in something. Choose something, dive deeply into it. And if it ends up not being for you, like that's okay. Like you can change in the future and move, but going deeply into something and like reading into it or becoming passionate about it, even if it ends up not being for you, is still really useful. And like worlds always collide. So if you choose to do something else, it will be useful in some way and it won't be wasted time. That's what I'd say. Yeah, it doesn't matter so much. Just kind of like follow your nose.
Nice. I like that. Strong following advice. Thank you for coming to the podcast, Jimmy.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. Oosh.